I've always found the coast chapters in Half-Life 2 to be surprisingly peaceful, but also a little bit unnerving. It stands in remarkable contrast to the preceding chapter, We Don't Go to Ravenholm, where you fight off swarms of zombies, only to be guided out of the town by a deranged monk. Quite frankly, when you put it like that, it sounds almost comical. You spend an entire evening in this almost Kafka-esque environment, finally finding some respite from the horrors after literally going into the light after leaving the mines. It almost feels good to see the Combine snipers along the railway, just as it does when you meet the rebels shortly down the line. You've escaped the nightmare, and you enter a slightly better nightmare. I find it to be relatively inarguable that the coast chapters are peaceful, especially when you compare it to chapters like Root Canal, Anti-Citizen 1, and the aforementioned We Don't Go to Ravenholm. What stands true, however, is that while the coast may appear to be peaceful, it also bears an underlying sense of dread, and shows the fundamental nature of living on Earth under the Combine rule. You don't really notice it when you play the game, but when you take a closer look, you start to realize that the coast of Half-Life 2 is nothing short of an extraordinary lesson in environmental storytelling. It may give off the illusion of peace, but it's merely a facade that is shattered when you notice the death, oppression, and the ultimate reality of living in a Combine-occupied world. To further delve into this idea, it's first important to understand what the coast represents to humanity and its value to the Combine. To both sides, the coast is not a safe place. Along Highway 17, you witness dozens of corpses, swarms of antlions, and heavily damaged roads, making the whole area a dangerous environment to either live in or travel through. However, its distance from City 17 and Ravenholm also lends itself to being safer than most places surrounding the Citadel. Its relatively isolated position makes it a haven for rebels and those trying to escape the oppression of the Combine. Even Eli himself tells Alyx and Gordon to flee to the coast following the attack in Black Mesa East, stating,
"Take Gordon out of here. Head for the coast. Do not go through Raven."
While his remark is obviously directed at purely getting the two to safety, it does raise the question as to whether it's the only way out, or if it's merely the next safest place to be. Certainly, the dangers of the coast may suggest that this is not the case. However, there are clues to suggest that it is a place of refuge for certain citizens. For the Combine, the coast is not a major priority, at least prior to Freeman's return. In fact, the Combine presence is relatively limited, but not unseen. Despite their scarce presence, their effect on the planet as a whole is still witnessed. The sea that borders the coast is the greatest example of this, with beached ships and moss indicating that the sea level has dropped dramatically, a consequence of the Empire harvesting the planet for its resources. This detail, specifically in regard to the Combine's goals of planet Earth, is not really seen outside of the coast. What it does is offers us a clearer, broader view into the threat that they represent. Sure, the Combine are an oppressive, violent regime led by an authoritarian leader, but the Combine soldiers and Metrocops pose less of an existential threat to humanity than the relentless consumption of its resources. The coast fundamentally exists as a reminder of this, a parallel between showcasing the more unspoken atrocities that the Combine committed, while also acting as refuge for those attempting to escape the very same regime. This region, acting as a place of escape, is suggested by the presence of numerous crashed cars, and the nature of the coast as a developed area. While motor vehicles, both damaged and seemingly functional, are seen throughout the game, their presence is fairly significant along Highway 17. Some of these have seemingly been abandoned for a long time, with certain vehicles lacking tires, engines, and most of their critical components. On the other hand, there are examples of the rebels frequently and recently using the same route as a way to navigate the coast. Alyx's own line in Shorepoint Base proves this, when she says,
"Gordon, I haven't driven the coast in over a year, but I have no reason to think it's gotten any safer."
Alyx's remark about the coast not being safe is proven by one instance of a crashed car. Prior to arriving at Dock 137, a heavily damaged yellow car can be found, wedged between two rocks. Next to it is a small cache of rebel supplies, accompanied by a fresh corpse. The exact nature of how this car ended up here is unknown, unless they just drove off the top of the cliff adjacent to it. What's more important is that this scene shows that while the coast is dangerous, it's an essential route for both rebels and civilians to get away from City 17, a route that some will take, even with the potentially fatal risks. This is seen in other instances, like the tunnel of the traffic jam that's packed full of zombies. Furthermore, there's also another traffic jam just ahead of Dock 137, where you fight the gunship, with an abandoned van full of rebel supplies just up the road. While we don't see any working cars in Half-Life 2 besides the buggy and combine APCs, these wreckages imply that there are cars which are frequently used by the civilians to navigate the coast. The combine roadblock later in Highway 17 would prove this. We don't see any roadblocks anywhere else in the game. Yet, the combine have set up a semi-permanent checkpoint, certainly not just for Gordon Freeman. Whether civilians actually make it through unharmed is not known. Directly adjacent to this roadblock are 2 car wreckages, either from civilians attempting to avoid the roadblock, or remains from people that the Combine view as dissenters or rebels. As mentioned earlier in the video, the Combine presence on the coast is limited, but still notable. While there is of course their more existential presence with the lower sea levels, their direct presence generally involves gating off the highway, providing reconnaissance, and eliminating rebel cells. Their existence is generally scattered along Highway 17, but there are multiple instances where their influence is still felt. The very first house you see along the highway is an excellent example, a relatively unassuming building with a dark connotation. Upon entering inside, the roof is seen to be torn through, damage done by a Combine shell that is seen to have landed in the basement. This house is not occupied with Combine or rebels, but rather by zombies, a product likely the result of the shell seen just below them. Whether it was the Combine or the rebels, the building was tagged with a skull and crossbones, indicating the danger inside to anyone who approaches or passes by. Just a bit further down the road, another house can be seen, except this one is occupied by a Combine reconnaissance force, who spies on New Little Odessa just across the bay. While it's unknown whether the rebels ever occupied this building, it shows the Combine's determination and desire to snuff out any resistance, even if it's in an isolated area like the coast. The idea of isolation is a notable trait that the coast bears. It is a calm place, especially when you pit it against every other area in the game. Frankly, it's the only place in Half-Life 2 that actually just feels relaxing. That is the entire reason it's my favorite part of the game. The lack of any major human settlement, Combine death squads, and the general absence of man-made structures makes the area feel like a thematic reset, which works very well, especially given that it precedes the chaos of Nova Prospekt and the Uprising. It almost feels ghost-like, and the consistent thick layer of fog over the sea lends itself to this idea. The entire chapter has you traveling along the beaches and cliffs of the coast, with the ocean almost acting as a metaphor for the desires of the human race. You can't go into the ocean. If you do, you end up being devoured by thousands of leeches. But it seems peaceful, and the only real place where you don't find the Combine. Yet, it's unreachable. It forces you to keep looking for an island. Perhaps not a literal island, but a place of refuge and safety, where you can stand in the light instead of under the shadow of a cruel and vicious empire. The large train bridge that Gordon crosses later in the chapter is actually a great example of what I'm trying to convey. Next to it is a property, with a destroyed home, a garage, and a large house. This house is mostly insignificant in its own right, and it doesn't have any importance to Gordon Freeman's goals, though this house does have a special meaning in the context of living under the Combine. Almost every single window is boarded up, and the house itself lacks any form of light source, only letting in natural light through gaps in the wood planks. The beds, food, and civilian corpses in the house show that it was lived in, and it acted as a refuge for those trying to escape the Combine rule. While they of course would ultimately succumb to the soldiers occupying the area, it stands to show what life is like for the human race. That even if you manage to escape City 17 and any of the other cities, the Combine are always there. Even the house itself, against the backdrop of this giant Combine-controlled structure, showcases that the world is changing. The world has changed, and even the places that were considered isolated and safe are no longer that. Encampments like NLO tend to use generators and seemingly windmills to power their operations. this is likely an intentional choice more so than a matter of necessity, given its direct proximity to power lines. There's no direct evidence to suggest why they would do this, but you could certainly speculate that it's to keep a lower profile. After all, we've seen that the Combine already know that they are there, and in a moment where the bastion of resistance at Black Mesa East is crushed, life for civilians and rebels on planet Earth can seem hopeless. When you defeat the gunship at the very same place, all the fighters look exhausted, desperate, and almost hopeless even in the presence of someone so revered like Gordon Freeman. I do feel as if my words in this video may not necessarily get across the point I'm trying to make. And quite frankly, I think that's to do with the nature of the coast as a whole. Back in the Half-Life 2 beta, the coast was portrayed to be a literal wasteland. A junk-filled hellscape with thick smog in the sky. Compare that to the retail release, and the difference is night and day. In my view, that's what makes the coast, and really Half-Life 2 as an entire game. A lot of dystopian settings are extreme or more explicit, and the beta is actually a perfect example of that. Just look at the Consulate to Breen, Eli Maxwell to Eli Vance, and the Wasteland to the coast. All their predecessors resembled dictators, mad scientists, and uninhabitable wastelands. They're cliché, but they also don't have much depth to them. The retail version of Half-Life 2 tells so much of its story through environment and design. It's the entire reason videos like this exist, to allow you to make your own conclusions about the background, story, and meaning of a place in a video game. It is the entire reason that I really like Valve games. Were my channel not already proof enough of that? The coast especially is a perfect representation of how subtlety and environment can tell stories without uttering a single word. That can completely change our understanding and perception of a world, especially one as cruel, complex, and as beautiful as Half-Life. Thank you so much for watching and sticking through this one. This was a very difficult video to write, so if you enjoyed it and want to keep up to date with all of my projects, consider following me on Blue Sky. If you just care to keep up to date with my uploads and nothing else, then make sure to subscribe. Whatever you think I'm working on next, no you don't. Peace and love, Smellies.